It was a hot summer night, and despite the tranquility, something in the air seemed strange. Jake, a 17-year-old boy from Davenport, a small town in Iowa, felt uncomfortable, as if he was being watched. But when I looked around, I saw nothing. He was neither fearful nor superstitious, but that night, something made him look at the dark garden behind his parents' house. Jake was alone that Friday. His parents were in Chicago, as they always were on summer vacation. Unlike them, Jake preferred to stay at home without worrying about travel. By the time he was 17, he was independent enough to take care of himself, cook, and even do his laundry. Everything seemed peaceful that night. The TV was on, and the soft sound of the fan filled the room as he enjoyed a glass of juice on the kitchen counter. As the silence of the night stretched, a strange sensation came over him, something he couldn't explain. He stood up, feeling a light breeze coming through the open window. The trees in the garden swayed gently, and darkness seemed to engulf every corner of the space behind his house. "Is it just the wind?" thought Jake. But as he watched, a strange shape appeared in the distance near the fence. At first, he thought it was one of the garden furniture, perhaps the large parasol they used during weekend barbecues. However, a strange sensation took over him. Something was wrong. But as he watched, a strange figure appeared in the distance, near the fence. At first, Jake thought it was some garden furniture, perhaps the large parasol they used for weekend barbecues. But then, an indescribable feeling came over him. Something was wrong. He didn't know what it was, but he knew he wasn't alone. When he looked closer, the figure seemed to twitch, changing, as if it were a shadow taking shape. Gradually, the shape was outlined. A human silhouette, but its features were distorted, almost as if the body was made of something that should not exist. He squinted, trying to understand what he was seeing. The figure was tall and skeletal, with arms too long and thin for a human. But what made him stop was his head. It was not a human head, it was a cat's head. His yellow eyes glowed in the darkness, reflecting the streetlight in an unnatural way. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. The darkness behind the house now seemed to come to life, taking the form of something that didn't belong in the real world. The figure that emerged from the shadow was not human. His yellow, piercing eyes shone in the darkness with an otherworldly glow. The creature was tall, skeletal, with long, disproportionate arms. But what made him tremble most was his head, a cat's head with pointed ears and a fierce countenance. The creature was advancing, but its steps were softer than those of a human being, as if floating on the ground. She was getting closer and closer, and Jake could feel the weight of her presence, as if he were being watched by something predatory. The feeling that he was no longer alone became more and more unbearable. While still trying to process what was happening, Jake looked at the clock on the wall. At 9:30 p.m., an ordinary time for any young person who was at home alone. His parents, as usual, were in Chicago for the weekend, a visit to the family that took place every year. In fact, it was nothing unusual, but the feeling of being alone in that house was not the same as always. The house, which had always felt comfortable, was now heavy, as if some strange presence filled it. Determined not to let fear take over his mind, Jake got up from the counter and went to the kitchen window. He leaned over the parapet, trying to make out the dark form that still stood motionless on the fence. His eyes adjusted to the darkness, but the image was too far away for him to understand what it was. However, his mind was already full of questions. What is this? And why? Is it their element? Not wanting to sound paranoid, Jake went to the back door and looked more closely. He knew that most of the time his home was a quiet place. He had lived in Davenport since he was a child, and he had never been afraid of his own home before. However, this night was different. Something in the air felt denser, and the usual calm was missing. He hesitated, but then convinced himself that he should check. When he looked out, what he saw almost made him fall backwards. The figure seemed motionless, but somehow as if it was approaching him. His eyes sparkled, piercing the darkness as if they were watching his intentions. With every step Jake took back, she moved forward, but not in a human way. The movement was irregular, almost as if it were made of shadows that stretched and contorted, molding themselves as he approached. As the figure entered the light, Jake saw more clearly the cat's head, its yellow eyes shining with an otherworldly intensity. She had the posture of a woman, her shoulders broad and hunched, but her face was a macabre mixture of feline and human, with a piercing gaze full of inexplicable malice. Jake tried to rationalize everything, but dread began to engulf his thoughts. Something in his mind said that he was facing something impossible to understand, something that shouldn't be there. His breathing became heavier. He knew that the doors were locked and that the neighbors were home, but the discomfort of being alone that night with an unknown presence approaching could not be ignored. The figure somehow looked taller than a normal person. His eyes, even, from a distance, seemed to glow with an unnatural intensity. Fear tightened in Jake's chest as he tried to understand what was happening, and then an even stranger sensation came over him. Why was he starting to be calm? Maybe it was the mind trying to protect itself, but the feeling that he had already seen this creature, or something like it, made him even more uneasy. It was as if something was waiting for him, something that had been watching him for a long time. That's when he heard a soft, almost inaudible sound, as if the wind was whispering words in a language he didn't understand. But somehow, he knew that the sound wasn't coming from the wind. The voice was distorted, as if it was being imitated by something or someone. His instincts screamed at him to flee, but curiosity kept him there, trapped in the window, staring into the darkness, waiting for the figure to move. He knew he couldn't stay there for long. Something was pulling him out of the house, but at the same time, he felt a deep fear of crossing the threshold of the door. Should I go out and face the unknown? He didn't know, but he knew that the night was far from over. As the sound intensified, the footsteps that had once seemed light and distant were now closer, sharper. Now Jake could clearly see the creature. She was closer than he imagined. Its form was human, but the extremities of its limbs were disproportionate, exaggeratedly thin and long. His claw-like nails extended from his fingers, sharp and ready to tear. The cat's head, with pointed ears and a fierce countenance, was slightly tilted towards him. His eyes, large and yellow, were fixed on him, as if they were reading his thoughts. The creature's mouth opened slightly, revealing sharp teeth like those of a predator. A wave of dread enveloped her, not only because of his monstrous appearance, but because of the feeling that she knew exactly what he felt. She did not approach in a normal way. Her steps were like slides, almost floating, a smooth movement, but one that clashed with human nature, making everything even more terrifying. Jake's heart raced when he realized that the figure was no longer in the garden, but at the door, much closer than he could have imagined. Who else could be there, he thought, as tension took over his mind. His feet hesitated, but paralyzing fear kept him still. The door was closed, but he could have sworn he heard something knocking lightly on the other side. The seconds seemed to last an eternity as he stood there, staring at the darkness, waiting. But just as he was about to take a step towards the door, the sound abruptly ceased. The stillness that followed was more terrifying than the noise. What would I do now? Time seemed to drag on as Jake stood still, staring at the darkness behind the window. Fear, like a shadow, had settled in his chest and spread through his veins. He didn't know exactly what was happening, but something inside him, deeper than simple apprehension, was screaming for him to run away, or at least close his eyes and pretend that none of this was happening. But instead, he found himself more and more caught up in that feeling. The psychology of fear is something that can be difficult to comprehend, especially when you're experiencing this emotion at its most intense level. For Jake, that fear wasn't just a momentary feeling. It was like an invisible presence, constantly in his field of vision, distorting everything he perceived. The response he was experiencing was a primitive reflection of what psychologists call the fight-or-flight response. When we encounter fear, the body activates a series of physical reactions that prepare us to fight or flee. Jake's heart was racing, his muscles tense, and his hands were sweating. He knew he couldn't sit still for long, but his mind was divided. Should I run to the safety of the house, or is there something outside of it that I need to face? The psychological dilemma was clear. Fear paralyzed him, but at the same time, curiosity, mixed with a deep instinct for survival, kept him on the lookout, wanting to understand what was happening. Jake was not cowardly nor superstitious, but when I was alone in that house, observing the shadowy and distorted figure in the garden, any logic was undone in the face of the unknown. As he recalled, the fear of being caught off guard is one of the oldest human reactions, an emotion that our ancestors needed to survive. The unknown has always been a threat, and fear is an adaptive response, a way to protect our physical and psychological integrity. The fear wasn't limited to what Jake saw. The presence of the creature, the imitation of the voices, and the growing sense of being watched distorted his perception of reality. The fear was no longer just about what he saw outside the house, but about what was going on inside him. Anxiety, often described as the fear of fear, was consuming him, undermining his ability to act. His thoughts began to distort, and he realized that the sound of the wind was no longer just the sound of the wind. Every snap, every movement in the trees, everything seemed to have a purpose, as if it was being manipulated by an invisible force. The fear now became a self-healing, a response that made Jake move away from what was normal and expected. The little things, like the rustling of leaves or the slight cracking of doors, began to sound like imminent threats. His breathing became heavier, and the feeling of claustrophobia took over him. Even inside his home, he felt trapped. It was in its space, but that space now seemed to be invaded. The anxiety of being in imminent danger, but not knowing where it would come from, is something that messes with anyone's mind. And for Jake, this psychological fear began to feed on uncertainty. He knew he had to act, but anxiety made him hesitate. He didn't want to make a wrong move. He didn't want to take a step that would put him even closer to danger. At times like this, psychologists point out that the human mind becomes more vulnerable. When fear mixes with uncertainty, it creates a disturbing emotional state, where choices become difficult and any move can seem fatal. And it was then, as a terrifying revelation, that Jake realized he was no longer just afraid of the creature in the garden. What paralyzed him was the idea that danger might be much closer than he imagined. What lurked in the darkness was not just a monster, but something far more insidious, a presence that could invade your mind, manipulate your thoughts, and drag you into a distorted reality. The instant he realized this, the figure moved, not as a human being would, but in an abrupt and erratic way, like a shadow that stretches and writhes in the darkness. Jake didn't know if he was seeing what he thought he was seeing. Panic took over his body. He quickly moved away from the window, but before he could turn to run, the back door creaked slowly, as if something was trying to get in. Fear was now no longer restricted to a single spot in the garden. He had already invaded every corner of the house, and Jake knew he could no longer ignore what was happening. Jake felt an inexplicable chill run down his spine as he tried to process what he had just realized. The back door creaked louder and louder, as if a presence had infiltrated his house. For a moment, he wondered if he should run to the neighbors, call the police, or just lock himself in a room and wait. But on some level, he knew that none of this would solve it. The idea of being completely alone that night had never felt so real. Solitude until then, something comfortable and familiar, now felt like a prison. He had always known that his parents' home was a safe place, a quiet refuge from the outside world. But now, each wall seemed thicker, more oppressive, as if space itself was beginning to turn against it. Being alone has never been as terrifying as it was at that moment. Jake stepped away from the window with trembling hands, desperately looking for a way to rationalize the situation. "I'm just imagining it. It's not possible," he thought, trying to convince himself. But his mind kept coming back to the same idea. There's no denying what's going on. He felt the weight of vulnerability crush him. At that moment, it didn't matter how hard he tried to keep his cool. The house he thought was safe was now full of shadows, of sounds he couldn't control. He knew that if something wanted to get in, he had nowhere to run. The thought that he was completely alone settled in his chest, and loneliness no longer seemed comforting but unbearable. The vulnerability became physical. Every crack of the wooden planks beneath his feet seemed amplified. Every sound of the house felt like the prelude to something approaching. He turned to the hallway, where the rooms were dark and silent, as if he were in an unknown place. In another situation, he would have felt comfortable there, but now everything seemed strange and threatening. The fear of being alone wasn't just about not having company, it was the feeling of not having anyone who could understand or help. There was no obvious way out. The very concept of home had already become distorted, and what had once been a fortress now seemed fragile, with its thin walls and doors that creaked in a frightening manner. Loneliness wasn't just about the lack of another person by your side. It was the feeling of being completely irrelevant to the outside world, of being left at the mercy of something he could barely comprehend. It was an existential loneliness. Fear was feeding on his insecurity, and the creature he observed outside seemed to be a reflection of this growing emptiness. He tried to deflect his thoughts, but the more he tried to push away the anxiety, the more it took over his mind. He knew he was being watched, but he didn't know where the threat would come from. It was as if he was being watched over by something that understood his loneliness, that knew his deepest fears. Jake looked at the door again, feeling the urge to close it, to lock himself and hide somewhere safe. But deep down, he knew that security no longer existed. He was exposed. Everything around him seemed like a labyrinth with no way out. He looked at the phones, but panic paralyzed him. Any move seemed wrong. Any action seemed to bring more danger. He could no longer rely on his own senses. That's when he realized that the sound of the back door was no longer the same. Now there was something more, something alive in the house. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end, the wind coming in through the cold window. Every step he took seemed to echo louder, as if the house was absorbing his presence, waiting for something to happen. The silence became deafening, filled only by the sound of his quickened breathing and the beating of his heart. Loneliness in his mind became a silent cry. He was there, alone, and any action he took now seemed to be useless. He was vulnerable, not knowing who to trust or where to hide. That's when something moved in the hallway. He couldn't understand what it was, a shadow, a silhouette, but she didn't look human, something big and heavy. The creature was closer now, and Jake realized that it wasn't just the fear of loneliness that haunted him. It was vulnerability in the face of something he couldn't control, something he couldn't face. The creature was there, inside his house. The back door was now wide open, and the sound of claws on the floor caused the air to become denser. Jake didn't know what to do. But one thing was certain, he was no longer alone, and perhaps it never was. The world around Jake began to lose clarity. It was as if reality, until then so solid, had distorted, fading into the shadows that now filled every corner of the house. He blinked several times, trying to concentrate, but what he saw no longer seemed to be the truth. The walls, the doors, even the wooden floor under his feet, everything seemed to be distorted, as if his vision was being manipulated. The feeling of disconnection was almost instantaneous. The fear was no longer limited to what he saw in the darkness outside, but to what he felt inside his own mind. He knew something was wrong, but he could no longer trust his own senses. Fear was now invading his perception of reality. The sound of her own breaths seemed amplified, reverberating on the walls and in her chest. He felt as if he were immersed in a parallel reality where the laws of the ordinary world no longer applied. He forced himself to walk down the hallway in order to maintain control. Each step was an effort. The shadows seemed to stretch out in front of him, as if they were breathing with him, distorted and alive. The house, which he knew so well, now looked like a labyrinth, each corridor longer, each door darker. He felt trapped, unable to escape from it, and he knew that this sense of distortion was a reflection of the internal battle his body and mind were waging. "That's not real," Jake thought repeatedly, but the words rang hollow in his mind. He was no longer sure what was true. What he felt didn't seem to be just fear, but an altered perception, as if something was controlling his thoughts, distorting what he saw and heard. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to reorient himself. When she opened them again, the house seemed like a completely different place. The light in the hallway, once bright, now seemed darker, as if reality was being sucked into the void. He walked to the living room window, his muscles tense, his body heavy, as if every move was harder than it should be. What he saw outside made his heart leap. The figure in the garden was no longer motionless. It moved, but not in the way he expected. It wasn't a person or an animal. It was something fluid, something that changed as he looked, as if it were composed of a mixture of shadows and light. His mind screamed for him to run, but the hypnotism of the shadows kept him tethered to the window, unable to move. The line between what was real and what wasn't seemed to disappear. The movement of the figure in the garden was incoherent, and the way it faded into the shadows gave the impression that it was not really there. Or maybe he was. Jake didn't know anymore. What he perceived was increasingly far from what he knew was possible. Each shadow in the house seemed to have a shape of its own, something that was trying to manifest in his mind, something that shouldn't be there. He knew he was losing control of his own perceptions. The idea that she could be dreaming or imagining all of this seemed more plausible by the second. Is this really happening? The doubt was overwhelming, and he tried to close his eyes, but the images kept forming, more intense and chaotic. He no longer knew where his mind ended and where the presence that haunted him began. He was being devoured by uncertainty, unable to distinguish what was real and what was being imposed on his perception. Reality was now disintegrating, replaced by a constant feeling that he was on the verge of something immense, something that was out of his control. He felt a growing pressure in his head, as if something was pulling at the threads of his mind, trying to distort his thoughts and take him even deeper into this nightmare. As the creature got even closer, Jake realized that it wasn't just moving around the garden. It was inside him, inside his mind, manipulated by his own perceptions. The shadow stretched to the window, and for the first time he saw clearly what was before him. He was no longer an indistinct figure, but a real, shadowy presence, with eyes that shone like lamps in the night, eyes that knew him, that watched him from a place he could not understand. Jake blinked, trying to wake up, trying to break free. But what was happening was not a nightmare. It was more real than anything he had ever experienced. The creature's presence, now closer than ever, seemed to envelop Jake like a heavy mist. He could feel his breathing quickening, panic spreading through every part of his body, but at the same time, something stronger was forming inside him. A desperate need to understand what was happening, to confront what he could no longer ignore. He knew he could no longer run away, he could no longer hide inside his own mind. He needed to act. But the conflict within Jake ran deep. The struggle between reason and fear, between escape and confrontation, made the situation even more distressing. What was real? What was he supposed to do? His legs were shaking, his senses were overloaded, but he felt that if he did nothing, the pressure on him would only increase. He was in a state of emotional paralysis. On the one hand, his mind screamed for him to run, to lock himself somewhere safe, but on the other hand, there was something in his mind that told him he couldn't let that happen again. The threat was within him now, not just in the garden. The sounds of the house, once comforting, now became like echoes of a prison. Every crack, every creak of wood seemed to scream in his mind, adding to the feeling that everything was out of control. The creature, though invisible at first sight, was in every space. It was no longer just the shape in the garden. It was in his mind, in his perception, distorting everything around him. Jake didn't know what else to think, but he knew that if he didn't stand his ground, he would completely lose control over what was happening. He looked at the door that led to the garden. It was the only way out, but he knew there was nowhere to run. The creature, now closer, seemed to be amused by its fear, as if it were waiting for its decision. She knew what he feared. She felt his fear absorbed him. The feeling of helplessness was overwhelming. Jake has never felt so vulnerable, so small. He tried to convince himself that it was all just a hallucination, a nightmare that he would soon wake up. But the fear was too real, the terror in his chest was too real. And he knew there was something beyond his perception trying to manipulate what he believed to be true. The conflict he now faced was not just a fight against what was outside the house, but against what was inside it. The fear he felt, the psychological dread, turned into something deeper, something that challenged him on an existential level. He knew something terrible was happening, but he couldn't understand what exactly. How to face something so strange, so undefined. How to react when reality itself becomes a threat. The thought of leaving the house seemed irrational, but staying there was also a death sentence. Conflict was inevitable, and Jake felt increasing pressure as the creature got even closer. It didn't matter where he looked, it didn't matter what he did. She was there, watching him, daring him to act. There was a choice, but Jake didn't know which would be the wisest. Stay and fight the perception that was distorting his mind, or run in search of a refuge he knew no longer existed. The feeling of being hunted, of being watched by an invisible presence, dominated his thoughts. The fear was transformed into something more palpable, more physical. His mind, now filled with anxiety, made confrontation imminent. He felt a force that pushed him to act, to make a decision, no longer as an escape, but as a last attempt to rescue his sanity. He was no longer just fighting the creature. Jake was in a struggle against himself, against his own perception of reality, against the fear that consumed him. There was no more room for hesitation. The decisive moment was coming. The house seemed to breathe with him now. The creature was in the hallway, much closer, almost within reach of his hand. Could he face what was coming, or would the only option be to succumb to what had already taken over his mind? Jake didn't know what the next step would be, but he knew that the time for choice had come. Confrontation was no longer an option. It was a necessity. Jake felt his mind being consumed, swallowed by an overwhelming sense of dread. Every beat of his heart felt like thunder in his head, and time seemed to drag on in slow motion. His breathing, panting, sounded like a roar in his own ears. He looked again at the back door, now completely open, and felt the sensation of being cornered. The walls that were once a protection now seemed like barriers, slowly closing around him, further isolating him from reality. Anxiety was taking over every thought, creating a dense fog that prevented him from reasoning clearly. He could no longer trust his own senses. What was going on? The house he knew so well now seemed strange, transformed into a maze of unexplained shadows and noises. The feeling of being watched was so intense that he could barely distinguish what was true and what was just his fear-warped mind. Jake's thoughts became fragmented, as if his mind was slowly breaking. He knew that panic was taking hold of him, and with that, the feeling of helplessness increased. Did he really have control over what was happening? He wanted to run, but his legs were heavy, as if he were attached to something invisible. Fear was overpowering him, and he knew that with each passing second, he was getting further and further away from reality. The anxious thoughts were now in full boil. He could no longer concentrate. The creature, which had once seemed just a distant presence, was now at the center of his mind, stirring his perceptions and his deepest fears. Every crack of the wood, every sound of wind seemed amplified, as if the house was full of invisible beings ready to manifest. What else could happen, he thought? What else could he lose if he didn't make a decision now? But anxiety paralyzed him. Jake didn't know how much time had passed, but he felt the rising warmth of panic spreading through his body. He was on the brink of madness, and the line between reality and fantasy seemed increasingly blurred. Each time he closed his eyes, the images came back more vivid, more real. The creature was inside his mind now, manipulating his perception, distorting everything he knew to be true. But what tormented him most was not just the creature or the fear of death. It was the feeling of being completely alone in this experience. He had no one to help him, no one who could understand what was happening. The fear of loneliness mixed with the anxiety of being consumed by something he couldn't see, but knew was there, lurking, waiting. He couldn't run away. There was no longer a safe place. The idea of asking for help seemed distant, almost impossible. The fear of being discredited, of appearing weak, kept him silent. He was caught up in a psychological game, a fight he couldn't win on his own. But deep down, he knew that the answer was not to run away or ask for help. The answer lay in facing it, even if it was a mental battle against terror itself. Jake swallowed. He didn't know if he was ready for it, but he knew he couldn't wait any longer. The anxiety was so intense that he felt his stomach turn, his mind about to give in. He looked out the window, and that's when he saw a movement in the darkness. Something was approaching, faster now. His breathing became even heavier, and he felt a wave of despair wash over him. Panic was inescapable. With every second that passed, he knew he was running out of time. But before he could take any action, a strange sound cut through the silence. A dry crack, followed by a very low whisper, almost like a voice, but which he could not understand. It was now or never. He didn't know if he could do what he needed to do, but he knew this was his only chance. Fear and anxiety were at their peak, and Jake felt like the last choice was about to be made. He just needed to step forward. But what would happen when he did? Jake felt a wave of heat run through his body as panic took over his mind. He was in a state of frenzy, where time seemed to drag on and distort, causing every second to drag on like an eternity. The sound in the house was now muffled, as if the room was being absorbed by something much bigger. The feeling of being watched was so strong that he could barely breathe. The creature, which had previously seemed like a distant presence, was now standing before him, though invisible to the eye. He could feel it. The air was heavy, almost impossible to breathe, and the tension seemed to be on the verge of explosion. The doubt turned into an overwhelming certainty. She was there. in the middle of the room, ready to attack. Jake knew he had no way to escape. He looked around, looking for a way out, but the feeling of being trapped in his own home consumed him. The creature was no longer a simple being on the outside, but an entity that had invaded his mind and body. It was real, and there was no more room for doubt. The struggle within Jake has come to a head. He no longer cared about what happened outside his home, but what happened to him. He could no longer live with that fear. He could no longer be consumed by this feeling of helplessness. It was time to act. He walked cautiously into the living room, feeling each step as if it were his last. The ground creaked beneath his feet, as if the room was sensing the creature's presence. He knew that any move, no matter how simple, could be enough to unleash what he feared most: the creature's final attack. The sound of his breathing echoed in the silence of the house, breaking the stillness. She was waiting for him. He felt it, with every fiber of his being. And yet, a strange sense of clarity began to emerge within him. He needed to confront her. He needed to understand what was happening and what was the true nature of this entity that consumed him. When he turned the corner to the kitchen, he saw for the first time a clear movement, a shadow stretching across the wall. It was her. Dread began to consume his mind, but a voice inside his head, a force he didn't recognize, made him move forward. "You will not be defeated. Not now." It was then that the figure finally manifested itself, coming out of the shadows. She had no definite form, but her eyes shone with supernatural intensity, as if they knew him. His muscles contracted and fear turned to fury. Jake was on edge. He knew he couldn't hesitate anymore. He had come so far, faced so much, that he could not give in now. The creature rushed forward, a blur of shadows and glowing eyes, but before it could take another step, Jake reacted. He screamed, something primal that came out of his throat, and with the force of all the adrenaline that ran through his veins, he launched himself against her. The energy in his body exploded into a savage force, and he felt the impact, as if he had crashed into an invisible wall. But the next moment, the shadow disappeared, leaving only the emptiness and the sound of Jake's panting. She had disappeared. At least that's what he thought. He looked around, the air heavy, the silence oppressive. It was just the beginning. Something was still watching him, something beyond the creature, something much bigger, something even more distant, even more evil. And Jake knew that this fight was far from over. The presence, now denser, more palpable, challenged him to continue. He hadn't won yet. The air in the house was thick, as if something invisible was holding Jake's breath. He still couldn't comprehend what had happened. The creature had disappeared, but the feeling that he was not alone was now stronger than ever. The environment around him seemed to be vibrating with a strange energy, a presence that he could not see, but that he felt in every fiber of his being. The house seemed to have changed. Each corridor was longer, each shadow denser. The lights, now flickering, seemed to be fighting against something greater, as if the electricity itself was being affected by the supernatural presence that had invaded the space. The fear that had once been mental now manifested physically, and the sound of his breath once again echoed through the place, as if it were the only real sound in a world that was disintegrating. Jake walked around the house in slow steps, his muscles tense, as if he knew he was about to be confronted again. But this time there was something different. He was no longer dealing with a visible creature, but with something much more complex, something that did not follow the rules of physics or logic. He had touched a parallel world, a layer of reality where what he saw could not be trusted. And now he was at the epicenter of this phenomenon. He arrived in the living room, where the shadows seemed to move on their own, as if they were living, tossing and turning and stretching in impossible ways. The feeling was that the walls themselves were trying to swallow him, creating a space that no longer had a limit. He felt as if the house was transforming, adapting itself for some unknown purpose. The supernatural was no longer in the garden or in the house only. He was inside Jake now, inside his mind, challenging what he thought was real. He heard that whisper again, but this time it wasn't just an imitated voice. It was something deeper, more powerful. The sound seemed to originate from the walls, from the floor, from the shadows themselves. He couldn't tell if it was a hallucination, a play of his panicked mind, or if there really was something there, talking to him. The reinforcement of the supernatural presence was inescapable. Something was moving within the walls, something that seemed to have deep knowledge about him, his fears and his insecurities. He tried to take a deep breath, trying to get away from the panic, but every thought seemed to be manipulated, distorted. He could no longer control his mind, as if the very space around him was taking control. The shadows began to stretch once more, taking shape before him. But they weren't just physical shadows, they were metaphors for what was going on inside. His mind, he felt as if he was being consumed by an invisible force, a force that used its own insecurities and fears against him. The environment was becoming even more distorted. What he saw was no longer the house he knew, but a grotesque and deformed version of it. And then he listened. Not a voice, but a presence. It was felt in his stomach, as if it was immersed in his bones. "You can't escape." It wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a clear, direct statement. He felt the weight of those words in his chest, as if the house had become an extension of something bigger, an invisible entity that watched him, studied him. Jake took a step back, but as he did so, the environment around him seemed to distort even more, as if he was being pushed into an endless spiral. Fear was growing, and he could no longer distinguish what was physical and what was mental. The walls were no longer walls, they were doors to another place. And that presence, he knew he was closer than ever. Jake didn't know where he was anymore. Fear was taking hold of him, and he didn't know what to do to free himself from this prison. He felt that the supernatural was becoming a part of his own soul, and deep down he understood. What was lurking was not just the creature, but something much bigger. The battle now was not just to survive, but to understand what awaited him, and perhaps even to keep his sanity intact. Jake felt that the world around him was slowing down. The air, once dense and overwhelming, now seemed to be dissipating, but not as he expected. There was something else, an eerie calm, a hold of time that made him wonder if he was still in his own mind. He still felt the weight of fear, but something was fading. The supernatural presence that had once haunted him now seemed to be in retreat. He was standing in the center of the room, not knowing what to do. The energy that once filled the space now seemed to have diminished, as if the house was somehow calming down. There were no more stretching shadows or distorted whispers. The air was in absolute silence. But this stillness, somehow, only increased the feeling of disorientation. Jake knew that something much bigger was still watching him, but he could no longer identify the source of the danger. When looking at the environment, the walls, which had previously seemed to be moving, were now firm and immobile. The shadows in the corner of the room, which seemed to come to life, were again inactive. But Jake didn't feel relieved. Something was wrong. He knew he couldn't completely rely on that silence. Peace, if you could call it that, was not genuine. It was just the calm before the storm. He took a deep breath, trying to find some clarity. His thoughts were confused. The fear was still there, but it was different now. It was as if his mind was processing the situation in a more rational way. But at the same time, the premonition of something terrible still paralyzed him. He knew that this feeling of emptiness did not mean security. He was not free. He was not safe. Something was still watching him. Something was waiting for him. Jake moved towards the hallway, more on impulse than will. He knew he needed to leave. He needed to understand what was happening. He no longer knew if what he saw was real or not. The doors were closed. The house was too quiet. He tried to keep his feet firmly on the ground, trying to convince himself that the threat had disappeared. But a part of his mind warned him, "Don't let your guard down. Not now." Jake's footsteps echoed through the empty walls, and as he moved forward, he began to notice a slight distortion in the environment, as if the walls around him were compressing, but almost imperceptibly. He tried to ignore it, focusing only on the need to escape the tension that surrounded him. But as he walked, he sensed something else, an invisible presence that now seemed to be only on his periphery, watching. He couldn't see her, but he could feel it, and that made him even more restless. The silence of the house, which had seemed to be a blessing moments ago, now became unbearable. He wanted something to move, for some other presence to manifest itself, to break the fear that consumed him. But nothing, only the emptiness and the echo of his own breathing. He stopped in the middle of the hallway. The house seemed to be remembering every move, and everything seemed to revolve around him, as if he were being pulled somewhere. The fear had receded, but he felt that he was being taken back to the same point. The place was too quiet. Everything was at a standstill, waiting to explode again. But then at the end of the hallway, something moved. He was not a shadow, nor a figure. It was just a movement, like a breach in absolute silence. Jake froze, feeling an indescribable coldness run down his spine. Something was approaching, but it wasn't what he expected. He knew that the momentary calm was not a victory, but only a temporary illusion. The worst was yet to come, and now he had to face something more insidious than he could have ever imagined. Jake could barely breathe. The house was strangely quiet, but at the same time, everything seemed to carry a palpable energy, as if space itself was vibrating with an invisible force. Every step he took seemed to echo in a distorted way, as if the sounds of his feet were picked up and magnified, reverberating through the walls with an almost unbearable intensity. He was no longer alone there. Something was watching him, something more terrible than anything he had ever imagined. He felt the weight of supernatural fear pressing on his shoulders. What once seemed like an ordinary home was now full of shadows that did not belong here. The walls, the furniture, even the air seemed to be being shaped by an unknown force. Jake forced himself to take another step. Each move was like a challenge to something much deeper and darker that awaited him. The space around him was no longer safe. It was a prison disguised as home. As he looked down the hallway ahead, a sense of indescribable horror invaded his mind. The shadows in the background started to move, but they were not ordinary shadows. They stretched, transformed, as if trying to take on a physical form. The corners of the house, which had previously been just part of the family scene, now seemed alive, almost as if they were watching him. The feeling that he was being hunted, that there was no more refuge, began to take over him. The creature, or whatever it was, now revealed itself in a much more intense and terrifying way. It had no definite form. It was as if she were a shadow, with a life of its own, a transcendent being who fed on her insecurities and her deepest fears. The air seemed to get heavier as she approached, and the atmosphere around Jake became denser, more oppressive. He could feel his bones ache, as if the house itself was being compressed by something invisible, something horrible. Jake tried to move, but his legs were heavy, as if the ground itself was trying to pull him down. Each time he took a step, the feeling of being watched intensified. He knew something was approaching. It was a presence he couldn't see, but it was taking over his mind, shaping his thoughts, fueling his fear. The voice that tormented him now no longer came from a physical being, but from something much deeper and older, something that could not be explained by human logic. She whispered in his mind. Her words were like an echo of an ancient threat, something that had existed long before him, before any human being. She was no ordinary voice. It was a force. The shadows that dragged along the ground seemed to approach, his leg enveloping him, as if they had a life of their own, as if they were trying to swallow him. Jake closed his eyes, but it was no use. He could feel the presence getting closer and closer. He tried to concentrate, to try to find some way, to rationalize the situation, but the reality was fragmenting. The space around him was distorting, as if he were trapped in a supernatural web, where physics and logic no longer applied. It was then that he heard a low, deep roar, as if the ground itself was screaming, and the light in the house went out, momentarily plunging him into total darkness. But even in the pitch black, Jake knew that the presence was right there, that it surrounded him, waiting for the right moment to claim his soul. The fear became physical, almost tangible, and he felt the urgent need to flee, but his movements were slow and heavy, as if the very air was trying to trap him. The moment Jake tried to react, he felt a cold, invisible hand pressing against his chest. He knew he was being consumed by something much bigger than he imagined. The house, the shadows, the presence, everything was converging on a single point. He needed to escape. But was it possible to escape from something that had already taken possession of reality itself? He didn't know it, but he knew that the fight for his sanity was about to reach a new level. The real threat was now awake and stronger than ever. Jake found himself in a constant battle, not only against the supernatural, but against his own mind. Fear was no longer just a sense of dread, but a veritable force that consumed him, eating away at his sense of reality. He could no longer distinguish where the house ended and where his own doubts and insecurities began. What once seemed like a simple family space was now a mental prison, the psychological pressure intensified by the second. He was trapped not only in physical space, but in a web of thoughts that made him question every step, every movement. The invisible presence that watched him was not only a manifestation of fear, but a reflection of what he carried within him. It was as if his own mind was feeding the monster, giving it strength and substance to every thought of despair. At that moment, Jake understood that the real enemy was not the creature or the distorted environment around him, but rather the way he dealt with isolation. He had always been someone who isolated himself when the going got tough. The unspoken conversations with friends, the estrangement from his family during times of emotional pressure, all of these contributed to this sense of helplessness. Inner loneliness had left him vulnerable, and now he was forced to face the consequences of this disconnection with others. The human mind is a powerful tool, but it is also fragile. When confronted with the unknown, with the incomprehensible, she begins to distort perceptions. Fear, when not confronted in a healthy way, can transform what is rational into something irrational. Jake now saw the walls of the house closing in, but he knew that this wasn't just the physical space compressing. It was the compression of his mind, his thoughts, his understanding of himself and reality. His loneliness had made him more susceptible to what was happening there. He could no longer rely on his own rationality. Everything around him was so disjointed, so chaotic, that he didn't know who to trust anymore. Fear became a mirror, reflecting its own inner flaws and weaknesses. The shadows were no longer just darkness. They were a projection of his deepest fear, of the parts of himself that he preferred to ignore. The house, which once seemed like a refuge, was now a reflection of her emotional state. Mental tension translated into physical distortions in the environment. He was trying to find a balance, a way to restore control, but it was like trying to regain sanity in a world where the rules had been subverted. Jake's real struggle was not against what was physically present, but against the images and fears he himself had created within himself. The voices that tormented him did not come from outside. They were his own insecurities, amplified and distorted by the mental pressure and existential anxiety he felt. He was not only fighting against what was visible, but against human frailty itself. His mind was in a spiral, fueled by the fear that he would be unable to understand what was happening, the fear that it was real, and the fear that he would not be able to overcome his own inner limitations. Jake's perception began to distort. Once again, he no longer knew where it ended and where the real threat began. His thoughts were merging with his surroundings, and he felt that any move now could be his last. The psychological terror was becoming stronger than the physical threat. He needed to find a way to reconstruct reality, or the darkness of the mind would consume him completely. The real test was just beginning, and Jake knew he would have to face more than the shadows around him. He would have to confront the inner reality of his own existence. The darkness in the house, which had previously seemed to be just a reflection of the shadows, now manifested itself into something much more real and threatening. Jake, who had faced his own fears and seen his mind distorted by the pressure of the environment, finally understood the true terror that surrounded him. It wasn't the house, nor the creature, but what he had ignored within himself, his insecurities, his doubts, and the loneliness he allowed to grow up. What had consumed him was not only the supernatural that surrounded him, but the way he saw himself in the world. As the house seemed to distort around him, Jake found a moment of clarity. He realized that no matter how hard he tried to escape, the real battle wasn't to get away from the shadows or run away from what was watching him. The fight, in the end, was against himself, against the fear he carried inside his mind. The horror he faced was actually a manifestation of what he had become, by closing himself off from others, by allowing his own thoughts to turn into a mental prison. As he looked at his surroundings, Jake saw how the house, with its shaky walls and unsettling shadows, became a projection of his own mind. Every room, every dark hallway, was a part of himself that he had ignored. The loneliness he felt, the feeling of being lost, now made sense. It wasn't the physical environment that was imprisoning him, but the way he treated himself and others. The psychological terror he lived was not only about the fear of an invisible presence, but about the fear of not being enough, of not being able to face his own failures. However, this realization was not an immediate relief. Rather, it was the beginning of a new understanding, one that would require him to confront everything he had ignored, everything he had hidden from himself. There was no longer any way to escape the truth. The fear that consumed him was not an external threat, but an internal construction fed by every doubt, every insecurity, every unresolved trauma. He understood that the supernatural was not a monster or an entity that he could defeat with force, but a force that he himself had created within his mind. He was the archetype of fear, of psychological horror, and now he needed to confront it. At the height of this revelation, something inside Jake began to change. The fight was no longer about escaping or surviving. It was about understanding and accepting. He knew that in order to overcome the real threat that surrounded him, he would need to face himself head-on, look at his flaws and limitations, and accept them as part of his journey. The supernatural he feared could no longer control him if he allowed himself to rebuild, to face his fears honestly. With one last look at the house, he understood that the true act of liberation would be to move away from what he had projected. Within himself, from the walls of the house to the very corridors of the mind, He could no longer continue to live, running away from his own humanity, his own feelings and frustrations. The horror, after all, was not in the house or in the shadows that watched him, but in the way he had allowed fear to dominate his life, creating a cycle of uncertainty and dread that imprisoned him. The house was still there, with its shadows, with its otherworldly presence, but Jake knew he didn't have to fear it anymore. He had faced the worst. He had faced himself. Now he could walk out of the darkness, not as a victim of fear, but as someone who had broken free from his own mental prison. He knew that what came next would be a path of self-discovery and healing, and that the greatest terror he would face in the future would not be what was around him, but what he chose to believe about himself. And while the house, which seemed alive with the energy of fear, lay behind, Jake took a step toward the light, toward a future where true horror would no longer be what he feared, but what he would now choose to create within himself. The journey was not finished, but he had taken the first step to live without being controlled by fear, and so Jake's true terror was not overcome by courage or force. It was faced by the truth. What he chooses to do with this truth now, only time will tell. And in the end, he knew that the greatest power lies in acceptance, not only of what is visible, but also of what is hidden in the shadows of the human mind.